All right, I'll make you look like a super badass. I could like
Really appreciate it.
superimpose a fire-breathing dragon in there if you want.
Like right over the corner, so it's like right here, you know.
I love it.
There is an assumption that queer America resides in the urban centers. However, there is some strong data to show that a large portion of LGBTQ individuals do in fact live in rural America. The Movement Advance Project, with data from the US Census Bureau, the CDC, and the Williams Institute, has determined that between 2.9 and 3.8 million LGBTQ people live in rural America. And that's why I think it is vitally important to understand the intersections of queerness, ecological location, and spirituality.
Hi, my name's leowt, and you have found your way to the Conversations podcast. Conversations exist to create spiritually minded conversations about life. We desire to create safe space for dialogue and community. We desire to come together regularly and intentionally to generate conversations about life, belief, and the intersection of the two. Everyone is welcome at the conversation.
What's up, friends? It's leowt here, and I wanted to do something a little bit different with this video, and I wanted to share with you a little bit of what I've been learning this semester at school in my studies. As you guys know, I went back to grad school this year, started seminary, but continued to follow some sort of sense or calling that I'm supposed to do some sort of spiritually minded work with my life. One of the classes that I took, which I have been dying to talk about on a video, was queer eco-spirituality. A lot of people hear the word queer and they immediately assume that it has to do solely with gender identity or orientation and or biological sex. But the idea behind queer theory and queer theology is the breaking down of binaries, especially because, as queer theory would argue, binaries are arbitrary and they're not real. They're put in place by people and societies. So I want to give you guys a little bit of an insight about how I thought and interacted with the idea of like queer ecological spirituality. Cool. So as a rural queer person, I'm very intrigued by the idea of the intersection of ecology, spirituality, and queerness. I'm highly interested in sociological and ecological context of rural queerness and the somewhat amorphous idea of spirituality. As such, I decided to research and retell stories from queer rural America. I might add stories from outside of America, but as of now, it's queer rural Americans. While the idea of queerness is usually linked to an urban environment, I noticed that in my own experience in rural Western New York, that understanding was very much challenged. I live in a fairly queer area for as rural as it is. I've come out not one, but 3 times in rural America, in rural Western New York, and I'm still here. And much to my surprise, I've been met with a chorus of "me too," which I didn't expect to find so many other queer people in a town under 13,000 people. It's wild. I can't even understand it. So, but I have come to notice a symbiotic relationship between queer people and rural ecological location. When I say ecological, people just think like the earth, but what ecological actually implies is the relationship between an organism, other organisms, and the physical environment and location that organism exists in. So like, I'm a queer person and my ecological location is rural Western New York. So I've kind of noticed a relationship between queerness and rural America that I didn't anticipate, which is kind of cool. But beyond the concept of queer as an identifier of sexuality and orientation, queer theory and queer theology is the lens through which I discuss this topic, this interrelated topic of rural location, queer identity, and spiritual identity. Queer theology and queer theory is firmly invested in the idea of breaking down and smashing all binaries, because they are not a biological or a naturally occurring function. Queer theorists would cite facts within nature to bolster this background, including the fact that there are over 29,000 queer species. And queer theorists use that as the foundation that queerness is natural and binary separation is not. So when we're talking about this, there's some implications that come up, right? Some binary implications. For almost all of the queer individuals that I interviewed for this project, there was a binarily driven thought process, right? That each individual thought they either had to leave or consider leaving their rural ecological location because of their queerness. I'm choosing the word ecological specifically here because of the concept of the interrelationship of ecology. So rural queer people in their rural environment and the people and places that they exist in on a daily basis. As such, with that understanding of a binary breakdown between queer people and rural identity, queer people, the ones amongst the people that I interviewed, almost every queer person thought they had to give up their rural ecological location so as to be able to fully self-actualize. And what's funny is quite a few of them, I would say over half of them, actually moved away to an urban area because they thought they had to, and then ended up moving back. But the kind of consequence of this binary is that rural queer people are constantly in an ecological debate in their mind where they have to justify their connectedness with their rural environment, which is crazy because you shouldn't have to justify why you live anywhere because you just live there. You are a part of that environment or a community. Something else to note, though, is that further compounding the psyche of rural queer individuals, especially the ones I have interviewed, is the idea of religion and spirituality in relationship to their ecological location and their orientation or gender identity. Several individuals that I interviewed cited finding open and affirming religious and spiritual communities as a main impetus behind their rationale for urban migration. The implication of rural America as a general overall was a general overall agreement of all of my subjects. Everyone that I interviewed said that the understanding of the spiritual context of their area was conservative evangelicalism or conservative capitalism. That was kind of the hallmark of their area. So these queer people were like, if I stay in rural America, where do I belong in terms of spirituality or religion if I decide I want to belong? The symbiotic connection between spirituality and religion and the rural environment, centering on conservatism, really compounds and complicates life for rural queer people. It's definitely led the individuals that I interviewed to feel that they must leave their rural locations to find safe and affirming religious and spiritual spaces. Now, obviously, the reason, not the only reason, but one of the main reasons that I do what I do is to create intersectional conversations, right? So that means intersectional meaning different categories and bringing them together. So this research project was perfect for me because it brought together the idea of queerness and rural location in the lens of spirituality. And so what I wanted to share with you is a couple responses and answers that I found really moving from some of my guests so that you guys could hear from a diverse group of rural queer people what their experience is like and how their ecological location impacts their orientation, their understanding of how the world functions, and their spirituality. So let's get to it.
Okay. So full name though?
Yeah.
Okay, Al Tahara. I'm currently studying at SUNY Geneseo, which is kind of like it's a little town. It's smaller than Olean, which is where I'm like mainly from. And Olean is pretty tiny too, but it's like but it's a bigger conglomerate of, everything surrounding it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, my name's Jake CC. I'm 18 years old and I'm from Mount Jewett, Pennsylvania.
The bustling metropolis of Mount Jewett.
I know, right? Skyscrapers everywhere.
Yeah, really. It's the amount of diversity that you guys have there is pretty much unparalleled in our area.
So my name is Kate Butler, and currently I'm a student in Northeastern Ohio, but my permanent residence is in Olean, New York.
I'm Amber Clifford Napoleon. That's my married name. And I live, the closest town is Montserrat. I live in the country. I don't live in town. So the closest town is Montserrat. I am in West Central Missouri.
All right.
It's largely farmland, and I live on a farm. I live on 13 acres.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tyler Titus, I'm 36 years old. I was born in Titusville, Pennsylvania, which is where they discovered oil. Very rural, very conservative, but there was a lot of wealth. That wealth did not stay, but there's a huge economic gap. It's about 50 miles south of Erie, Pennsylvania, where I now reside.
Hi there. My name's leowt. I am a hairdresser from a small town, Western New York, a very rural area. It's called Olean. Our population is about 13,500 whopping people. Very much a conservative area, very much a rural area. And I grew up in areas that were similar, if not smaller than this. Would you mind sharing with us your coming out story? Just kind of give an idea of what it was like to come out as yourself in rural America.
The way I came out is, I was 17, gonna go to college. So I was like, hey, I want to be able to start college as the person I want to be. So by coming out, I sort of tossed a letter on my mom's bed and ran away. Just waiting for someone to read it. I knew I would be pretty much greeted with acceptance, but I was still anxious because that's kind of the person I am.
I realized that I was not straight. I realized that I was queer when I was about 13. I just wasn't in full realization or secure in it until I was probably a sophomore or a junior.
Okay.
And that point I was like, I'll just wait till college.
You used college to put some distance between, your coming out and then your environment at home.
Mm-hmm. It was less of an environment at home and more of hometown, just because
Okay.
my family's very good when it comes to this stuff. It's just that it was just strange because of how small our graduating class was.
I came out when I was 12 in middle school. I realized that because I'd always sort of been like a tomboy, and then it just kind of all fell into place once I found the beautiful thing called the internet.
I think that brings up some interesting points about the idea of the internet as a digital ecological system. This is your environment, right? And then you have your lived environment. And I think sometimes for us in rural America, there's a distinct difference between what we hear in our digital environment and what we hear in our ecological environment at some point.
I knew that I was not straight early, but I come from a generation where knowing that early was not necessarily acceptable, allowed, or discussed, right? I mean, I'm 46, so, I was born in the 70s, the early 70s, and yeah, I knew when I was 10 or 12, but it was the mid 1980s, and there was none of that happening.
No.
So, and there was no internet, there was none of the kind of community that there is now for kids existed.
Yeah.
So I did not actually come out until I left my hometown. I lived here. As a matter of fact, the house that I live in was my parents' house. I live on the family farm.
Okay.
So when I left here to go to graduate school, which would be in 97,
Okay.
when I left to go to graduate school, I came out in grad school because I was living in a different state.
Right.
Right. So I really kind of went through and cut all my ties locally. I really did. I didn't plan on coming back. I certainly didn't plan on farming 13 acres. I just cut all those ties and came out and had a different life. And then things happened and I had to come back home.
Yeah.
And so I did not go back into the closet when I came back home.
So I have 3 coming out stories.
Me too.
Yeah. 3. three. The first one, and I had come out as a bisexual female identifying person at that time, and only out to a few friends, very few. Most actually were online, so they didn't actually exist in reality in my world that I didn't have to see. I started coming out to family and friends 19, like I just turned 19 and I was getting ready to leave for college. And so I was like, oh, by the way, queer, and like dipped, but didn't dip that far. I just moved an hour away. So far enough to feel safe. And like, again, like bigger city or on the college area. Once I got to college though, I started to more identify as being a lesbian at that point, and felt much more comfortable in that space and with that vernacular. And then around the age of 30, after I had been married, given birth to 2 children, I realized that I still didn't feel at home in my body and started to really dive into the gender aspect. So right around the age of 30, I came out as a trans male, and I was identifying at that point still as like bisexual. So I went back to being bisexual and identifying as a trans male. That felt more at home than I'd ever felt. And I always would joke that like I was, a trans male who was kind of like a closet gay boy, because I just still had a lot of effeminate attributes that I really hold near and dear. And it wasn't until like we were stuck at home in this pandemic, actually, and I had a lot of time to just think and talk through with my not that wife that I first came to, a different wife, I feel like she's just created a place for me to be and explore who I am and not feel judged or invalidated in any way. And it was then I realized that like I actually am non-binary. Like that's why it's never felt at home, because I kept trying to shove myself in all these boxes because I was told that's what I was supposed to do. Like, so I went from this feminine box to this masculine box. And I was like, well, neither one feels right, but this one definitely feels closer. So I'm definitely non-binary, but mask presenting. I like my beard. I like my flannels. I like my blue jeans, and society is determined that's masculine. So that's where I am. Like
my coming out story is diverse, because it didn't happen all at once and it happened in waves. I was assigned female at birth, and I never really felt right. There were times when I absolutely remember being little and praying to God, why didn't God make me a boy? And, just all sorts of like, I wanted to play with boy toys and I didn't want to wear a shirt. So all sorts of kind of cultural stereotypes, if you will. But I didn't really have any language to understand that that was actually something. That's really my context. But once I went to college, the very first day of college, someone came out to me as gay, and they told me that they came out to me as gay because they thought I was gay. And that to me was like the shot that cannot be taken back, the shot that changed everything that was heard around the world.
What is the spiritual kind of ecology, this systems that are prevalent in your area, if there are any?
So I lived 45 minutes from the camp where they filmed Jesus Camp.
No.
Yeah, totally. So I am like the little pin in the buckle that is the Bible Belt here. It is very much fundamentalist evangelical where I live. Even the more mainline Protestant denominations have a little bit of a fundamentalist flavor. So there you go. That is the religion of the day around here.
Christianity is pretty prevalent there, but I have not really partaken in any of that. But yeah,
but it exists.
I think Christianity, it's definitely there. The vibe is there. It's pretty heavily influenced like the town itself. I think like the culture of the town.
Yeah, I think so too. As someone who lives in Olean, it seems to me that like there are churches like on every corner, and while there are a variety of churches, they're still pretty much all fall within Protestantism or Catholicism. No, that's still the main churches. We have a synagogue. Well, we had a synagogue and we have a mosque, but those are more of the spiritual outliers, I would say. So,
what, if any, is your spiritual background?
My biological father was like a youth pastor. He ran the youth group. My mother and my stepfather were not very religious at all, and they like tinkered with it. I fell kind of in love with this Presbyterian church that had a youth group when I was around 16. And it was because it was like compromised of all the quirky kids. And that's where I found like that I wasn't judged. I was very much judged by the adults in there and the other people there. But with the quirky youth, I felt a connection that I hadn't felt anywhere else. I fell out of relationship with the church once I came out because I was told I wasn't allowed to be there. And growing up in a rural conservative space, like once one person knew, everybody knew. And so that's kind of where it ended. So when I was in Mercier's, I found I had a Buddhism class. And so I really started becoming more spiritual versus religious. And that's kind of where it has stayed with me.
Yes. So I was raised Catholic, confirmed Catholic. I went to Catholic school up until like 3rd grade. I still am connected to that faith. I still know that there's things that need to be done in the Catholic Church though, but the faith is something I'm very connected to still.
Right on, right on. So your connection to your spirituality maybe transcends the environment because you kind of, it sounds like you understand a little bit that maybe you need to be a queer Catholic person.
Yeah, just because I think that with any religion or anything that's as old as Catholicism, which is old, there's going to need to be some adaptation and things like that. So I just, although I still am very connected to this religion, I know that in the institution itself, there's some things that need to be, they need to be made better.
So my parents were raised Baptist.
Okay.
My mom was a Southern Baptist. My father was a Free Will Baptist. My mom left the church at 16.
Okay.
My dad left the church around the same time because my mom left the church. They were dating by then. But my mom was vehemently anti-Vietnam. She was an anti-war activist. And she did not see how she could belong to the church and be an activist against the war. She didn't see those two as working very well together. That's why she left the church. And my mother never went back. We did not go to church. My dad wasn't very open about his beliefs at all. The rule was if we wanted to go to church, we could pick the place our parents would take us, pick whichever path you want to pick or pick no path at all, do whatever you like. We're not going to make a rule.
All right.
So I actually practiced as a Buddhist first.
Okay.
I started practicing as a Buddhist when I was about 17.
Okay.
I've been to a whole bunch of retreats. I'm a very serious Buddhist and have been for 30 years almost.
Right.
But I didn't go back to a Christian church until the last 3 or 4 years, probably, because I had some experiences in childhood that taught me not to go there.
Understand.
Yeah.
Do you see yourself to be like equal parts Buddhist and Christian, or are you a Buddhist who attends a Christian church, or how do you kind of describe yourself?
I kind of describe myself as a Buddhist Presbyterian. Isn't that strange?
Presbyterian? I don't know. I don't know.
Presbyterian. I don't know how odd that sounds. Probably as weird as it is. I practice some pagan stuff too, so Buddhist pagan Presbyterian.
There you
go. I may be the only one of those. I'm not sure.
I don't know.
I know there's not a club for them. I don't know.
I always describe myself as spiritually non-binary because I can't like categorize it right now. So
no, it's just, it is what it is, right? So I belong to the Presbyterian Church in the closest, I'm going to say big town, and that means 18,000 people. That's the closest big town. So I belong to the Presbyterian Church there, and we go every Sunday, and I have a church family there that I'm very close to. But I also go to Sangha services every week and celebrate all the high holy pagan days, and it's sort of a mishmash of stuff around here.
Right. So you're just feeling out your spirituality and refusing to confine yourself. Is there a way in which the spirituality of your environment impacted your coming out?
It made me a little nervous because there's so much hardcore Christianity in rural areas. And a lot with a lot of that comes a lot of white nationalism and a lot of that Nazi sort of KKK behavior.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So in your lived environment, you know what I mean, in your tangible space, it was a little bit risky to come out. It would be fair to say.
Yeah, my household, no. My parents were perfectly fine with it, but just like going to school, walking down the street, it was a little scary.
My spirituality influenced my coming out in massive ways. Predominantly, it kept me in the closet for a very long time. Initially, my spirituality, my spiritual influence kept me from even realizing that I was gay, because there wasn't language, like gay didn't exist. So that was really the first part of my spirituality interacting with my orientation. And then once I gained the language and the realization that there was a good chance I was gay, when my friend came out to me my first day of college, that was when my spirituality began to just make me hate myself, and feel like I was going to hell because of being gay. Then my spirituality always kind of anchored me. And so by the time I was ready to come out, I had found some Christian people who were affirming, and open and accepting. And that made a big difference. It created the space for me to come out. Since that point, my sense of spirituality, has been intertwined with my coming out process. My sense of spirituality has evolved since that point. I don't necessarily know if I would refer to myself as Christian now, but I would say like Christian is kind of my first language, and I'm learning how to integrate that with all of the things I've learned about the world. But for me, spirituality was just intensely part of my whole life, for better or for worse. In what way, if there was any way, did your spirituality influence your coming out process?
Oh man, it really held me way back, to be honest, because I was identifying as somebody who was pretty religious when I was in high school, and I knew that, or at that time, I believed that I was gonna be like thrown into the fiery depths of hell, and so I struggled, and then had 2 suicide attempts because I would rather be dead than anybody know that. I would rather be remembered for who I was than anybody to find out my secrets, because I was just raised to believe that they were shameful and sinful. So, and it really influenced me quite a bit. And then when I got older, now it's not the religion that held me back. It was more of like, what are people going to do to my kids, that kept me more quiet. Like I could handle it, and I knew people were going to be shit to me because I'd already endured that a couple times, but I didn't want my kids to bear the brunt of it anymore. And that's where my big fear was.
Right.
Well, in the beginning, I think with anybody who's, got ties to a religion, especially a religion that has not had the best track record when it comes to queer people, is there was the whole worry about, like, does this mean I'm going to hell? Is this like what are the consequences of this? But luckily it was something that I eventually was able to find, my way through. I think a lot of people who grew up in the digital age, like I did, were very lucky to find representation, if there wasn't any, in our physical setting, because we were able to find queer like YouTubers or like influencers, people like that, who were able to provide very reassuring information with us.
I felt a lot safer coming out because I knew that my mom wasn't like super, like, like every other Christian mom in Olean. I kind of felt a safe haven in that, because I was a little bit like spooked by all of like the opinions that came from being Christian in Olean.
In what ways would you say that your rural area, your rural environment, how did that impact your coming out?
There's oh so with the rural setting comes the rural beliefs of this is a very Republican area, and again, I guess just there's a lot of not knowing, there's a lot of no representation, because people who would be able to provide that representation very understandably leave the area, which is what I plan to do. But so there's like this very enclosed environment that this area in general is. And there's a lot of people who aren't used to, you know, having to change or having to learn, which is very unfortunate. So there have been people, there have been teachers who have said that, you know, sexuality, it's a choice, you know. There have been things that have been overlooked, which is very upsetting, that I'm only starting to now realize that that's not normal, you know. And yeah, so I guess that's kind of like a generalized version, is that there's people that just don't feel the need to change, and then, you know, it just, the cycle just continues.
Absolutely.
I think, yeah, the I pushed it off for a while because I was scared of you know, being met with this awkwardness of running into someone, because the town is so small. So if, you know, you go to a corner store or a Walmart, there's going to be a stream of people, you know.
Yeah.
So I really pushed it off for a while because I was like, oh no, everyone in this town knows me. My name has been in the newspaper like 4 times. I would prefer if I didn't. I didn't want to draw attention to myself overall.
That had more of an impact than really just about anything.
Okay.
Because I didn't, you know, when you live rurally, and the other thing is that I was homeschooled.
Okay.
You know, my mom was a radical, not a religious homeschooling, radical leftist homeschooling was how I was schooled.
All right.
So I didn't have school to go to either. I didn't have contacts at school either.
Okay.
So I was isolated in a couple of ways. Now, I was active in a bunch of stuff. I was in 4-H and all that kind of stuff. It's not like I didn't have a social life, but being in a rural place, especially at that period of time, meant that, you know, the idea in my rural neighborhood at the time that I started thinking that I was not straight was that if you were gay, you were going to get AIDS, right? It was the mid 80s. So it was, if you were gay, you were going to get AIDS. And if you are gay, you probably already had AIDS. And, you know, it was that kind of thing. Rural America, at least in my part of rural America at that time, they were seen as synonymous. And really, when I came out to my parents so much later, 20 years later, my parents still thought they were synonymous. My parents were still like, does this mean you're going to get AIDS? I'm like, no, AIDS is a disease. That's not the same.
I'd like to ask you what your understanding was of like the ecological location of gay culture, right? Did you have an understanding of where gay culture existed or didn't exist?
You know, I thought about that since you sent me the question about whether I had some idea about where gay culture was, if I had that in mind. And growing up, I didn't have that in mind. I don't think I was in college until there was this idea that you associated, you know, gay men with San Francisco or something like that.
Okay.
It didn't really come to mind. For me, the big city was Kansas City.
Right.
Right. So it really, it didn't locate for me that way. I didn't think about queer culture as urban or rural. I didn't really think about queer culture at all. You know, it wasn't present for me. Right. I mean, it wasn't present until I got to graduate school. And then I was in a much larger town, and all I thought of was there's more gay culture here than there is in Montserrat. Right. So then it was just about like contact hours, you know, it was that kind of thing. Yeah. But did I ever think about it located in a particular place? I really didn't.
Well, you know, gays are in the city. That's what I've always heard. You know, I've heard that since I was a kid. You see that in like the movies of like the rich girls and their gay best friend perusing the city. It's like, I feel like it's really interesting that, you know, queerness is really associated with the big city, wherever that may be. Which is interesting because that sort of contrasted like some like internet phenomena that I've seen. Actually, there's this like little queer movement called, it's like an aesthetic called cottagecore, where it's the romanticization of rural life by queer people. And I found that super fascinating because it's like you know, you're not part of the city,
right?
And you're getting away. It's very much of a fantasy, but it encourages like sustainability and queer life in the country. which is coming back, which I didn't expect at all.
Yeah, so it seems like maybe there's some sort of like sociological move back to position queer life as something that can happen in rural America.
Yeah, which is really interesting.
Yeah,
It's
that is
definitely it's by it's just like this little fantasy by really young queer people, which is interesting, which says a lot about, like, you know, the young generation right now kind of wants to go back to the simpler rural life.
Yeah.
After
And they're not seeing their queerness as antithetical to that.
Yeah, exactly.
I have one final question for you.
Yeah.
Is there any distinct perspectives that you would like to share as a rural queer individual?
Yeah, I think that you know, you've asked me a lot of questions about where queer culture was located and about the city and things like that. And I think that there is this strong belief that rural people don't accept queer kids, that queer people aren't accepted in rural places, that queer people don't live in rural places, right? There's this strong belief that even if we were there, we don't belong. And just like with any other oppressed group of people, we're already here.
Yep.
And the people that we're around already know that we're here.
Exactly.
Right. And you can look at myriad studies about children in rural areas and queer kids of working class families, and the acceptance rate is higher than it is for middle class families and upper class families where appearances are more important than survival.
That is fantastically interesting.
Yeah. So I think for me, and it's not like I need a billboard, because I don't want everybody coming out here to take pictures of the queers, but I think that there's something to be said for understanding that queer people are in rural America and are not being chased down and harassed every minute of every day.
Yes.
Right? Because there's this idea that if we live in rural America, we must be consistently afraid for our lives. And I'll be honest with you, if somebody were to bother us, I would be really worried for that human, because I know what my neighbors would do. Right? So you know, it's a real flip the tables, but you have to think about it that way. When you live in a rural place, the relationships with other people are different than they are when you live in a city, right? You're not neighbor strangers. You can't be.
Right. You can't.
So you can't be.
Is there any distinct perspectives that you would like to share as a rural queer person?
I think we dove into some of those. I guess it's just so important for me for people to know that rural does not equate bigotry. It really doesn't. There is a fear, but there's a genuine love. There's a love for people. There's a love for life. There is a love for connection, and like genuine connection, and then like a genuine desire to just like have fun, have a good time, and to be like dismantle the judgment. Like growing up in a rural area is where I learned to, like, didn't matter what you had or you know what your last name was or who you were. If you were here, you were part of the family. Like that was just where those roots were instilled. Yeah, there are rural people who are bigots and assholes. There are. I genuinely believe though that those in the rural area have some of the biggest hearts and the most loving humans I've ever met.
Absolutely. It's something interesting that I've been hearing from a lot of people too, is that tension between this latent idea of, will I be met with resistance or will I not? And to be honest, I live in rural America and I have been met with resistance, right? I've taken a brick and I've received death threats, but that's the anomaly, you know? And so if there's bigots here, there's bigots everywhere. Just like there's bigots here and everywhere, right?
Right. And there's bigots in our community. There's bigots in the big city.
Yes.
I assure you, the bigots are alive and well, and some are really rich and living in like the midst of, the queerest of queer cities.
Yep.
There's
Yep.
bigots.
And have planted themselves as a part of that community as well. too.
Yes.
That you just
I,
want
I guess that you don't have to go to the big city to find yourself.
Mhm.
Like, I think that's one of the larger, aspects of this conversation is like, I found myself by like watching a VHS tape of Tarzan. So I, you don't have to go somewhere busy and bustling if it's not your style.
Mhm.
You can live a fulfilling queer life in a small town, and that can be enough for you.
Mhm.
I don't know if I would have gotten the proper terminology for everything if I didn't know. Like if I didn't experience internet culture, because I am so connected to it in my like day and age.
Mhm.
Um the digital like world is my second home.
Mhm.
So I have so much like I have a lot of care for it, and I use it every single day. I've used it since I was like 10.
Yeah.
So I think I probably would not have come out if I didn't have like digital support, because I found a lot of people who are similar to me and going through the same things that I didn't necessarily like seek out
Mhm.
in like real life.
Yeah.
So I think it was like a pretty big support.
Yeah.
I think that it's important for people who are planning on staying in like rural or especially people who have influence or interactions with children like teachers, coaches, etc.,
Mhm.
that you need to be aware that your students, the young people that you are with
Mhm.
might not be telling you everything. Like
Mhm.
I was closeted for many years,
Mhm.
and over that time I saw a lot of people allow conversations that were hateful towards gay people, or just minority groups in general. That they just allowed it because you don't assume that anyone in here really cares.
Yeah.
But there might not just be people who care and are allies, but actual people that are very hurt by that,
Mhm.
because and they can't feel the need to speak up because they're like, I don't want people to be suspicious. So I guess that's the main thing, is
Yeah.
just to make sure that you never know who's really listening.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
especially if you're in rural America and you're in a position of like leadership or a mentor type position like a teacher. I think you bring up a really great point. Like it's really important to remember that there really very well could be a closeted kid hearing this conversation. And if you're staying in rural America, what are you doing to make rural America more accepting, right?
Yes. Exactly.
One thing I have noticed is there's actually millions of rural queer people in America. And I think it's really interesting to point out that a lot of those rural queer people do not feel like they have to divorce their queerness to stay in their rural environment. And what's interesting about that is that's kind of the pop culture narrative. And so I think it's really interesting to see rural queer people who are spiritually open-minded, um, and they are staking their claim in rural America instead of feeling like they have to go to the Castro or something.
I don't know how to describe it. There's a disconnect. There's a disconnect where I feel like urban people are afraid of rural people and rural people are afraid of urban people because there's judgment on both sides.
Mhm.
When I'm running in this, for county executive right now, people in the urban area are afraid to come out in the rural because they think they're going to get shot.
Mhm.
People in the rural area are afraid to come into the urban area because they think they're going to get shot. And so,
Right.
you know what I mean? Like there's this belief that the other side is scary and hates them. I know I'm going all over, but that really has influenced. It influenced who I am, and how I came out, when I came out, and the fear, but also like this trust and this belief that most people are good. Because I grew up in a rural area, I believe that most people are good, and that really influenced me.
Yeah. As a rural queer person, I think it's an important and distinct perspective to exist. I think it's really important that rural queer people assert their existence, because I think that there is kind of in the negative space of all of our interactions, right? We hear that it is queer people that we need to be in an urban environment. And that kind of makes you think that you need to be in an urban environment to be valid. But rural queer people exist, and their existence is valid. And a queer person need not ever move from their rural setting to be a perfectly valid and fully self-actualized queer person. I think that's really important for people to know. Thank you so much.
This has been the Conversations Podcast. Thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions or comments, or just want to get involved, feel free to join the conversation on social media. You can find us at Conversations Official on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And please don't forget to rate, follow, and share this podcast. We're available on Anchor, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for joining the conversation.
We are very out and very proud lesbian farmers.